Folks, why don't we start up again? Let's join up. Okay. Thank you, folks. I hope you enjoyed your lunch and nice break. As promised, we're going to jump into these two instructional examples. Now, remember the setting. I'm supposed to teach 5th grade history, social studies. I have a textbook chapter to teach. And frankly, what the research is telling me is the reason why I'm finding it hard to understand. I'm finding it hard to understand because it's incoherent. And what you're going to see with that, in fact, let me show you what I mean by that. Look at this chapter. This is the American Revolution. I'm showing you all the text. I've taken away the graphics because there's 25 pages of graphics, but let me show you the text. The first section is the fall of Fort Ticonderoga. The second section is the Battle of Bunker Hill. That one goes on a little bit. The third section is the Second Continental Congress. The third is Washington takes command. The fourth is the British leave Boston. And the fifth is a good beginning. My goodness. Isn't it? Anyone who knows anything about American history is going, huh? You know, it's just a bunch of stuff, right? And what studies of both elementary and secondary, especially middle school social studies textbooks tell us is the pieces don't fit together. They're kind of incoherent. So people have done studies where if you revise these and you write in all the connections and stuff, guess what happens to the kids' comprehension? You know, it goes way up. Now, I wasn't in a position where I was going to say, well, let me rewrite this textbook for the textbook company. And I would think most of you aren't either. And so let's see what I did do with it. And what I did with it is I recognized that narrative history, and this is narrative history, they're telling stories to try to get their historical argument across. Stories are okay for making an argument, but you have to have some way of translating the stories into claims. And so I didn't know that's what I was doing, but I was actually teaching kids to do that. It worked out kind of nicely, which is why this ended up being studied by a lot of people. So we're not going to read this whole thing, but I'll read through parts of this to you so that I can show you what we're going to do here. So here's the first piece. The fall of Fort Ticonderoga. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, the British Army stayed in Boston. American forces camped around Boston, waiting for the British to move. Meanwhile, a young New Englander named Benedict Arnold had been appointed to lead 400 soldiers at Fort Ticonderoga in New York. After arriving there, he joined forces with Vermont's rough and rugged Ethan Allen. Allen led a group of rebels called the Green Mountain Boys. Before dawn on May 10, 1775, the Americans attacked Fort Ticonderoga. The British were sleeping peacefully. Allen woke up the commander by banging on his door and shouting, "Come out of there, you old rat." The Americans captured the fort without firing a shot. Inside, they found something they needed desperately: heavy cannons. That's the story, and it's going to go right into another story. There's a different story here about the Battle of Bunker Hill. And that one just starts out a month later, you know, in Boston. Here's what happened. So you know what that text looks like, right? Everyone gets that. So now what do I want the kids to do with this text? And what I'm going to want them to do, there we go. This is the little scheme that I made up that night when I was getting ready for my teaching. The first thing I wanted kids to do is something very, very similar. I wanted them to summarize the text. We've talked a lot about that, so you can see why I might do that. And essentially what I want them to do is, what's the section of text? And in this case, it was the fall of Fort Ticonderoga. Who was it about? Who was in that chapter? Ethan Allen was there. Oh, I didn't hear it. Benedict Arnold was there. American troops were there, right? British, the old rat, he was there. Okay. What happened? Well, we know that there was this, battle of fighting for that fort. The Americans won it. Where does it take place? It tells. It's in Fort Ticonderoga, New York. When? It gives the date that it happened. I believe it was April something. Now, let me describe the classroom where the kids are going to do this work. They give me 2 classes of 5th graders. So I've got 50 children in a fairly small space. They're packed in. And there are about a dozen teachers standing along the wall who are going to observe this lesson. It's very tight packed, probably violating some fire code or something. So I have to pair these kids up very scientifically. You and you, just whoever happens to be sitting next to each other has got to be the partners, because there's no way we could move around the classroom. What I want the kids to do is work together, get 1 sheet per pair, and what they have to do is summarize that first story, and just filling in those blanks. And I can tell you, now this is 50 kids, I can't tell you that every individual child was able to do that easily, but I can tell you every pair of kids was able to. So, it gives you some sense of how hard this is. They all did fine with the who, what, where, when. They had trouble with the why. Why is it important? And if we go back to that piece of the story about the fall of Fort Ticonderoga, what's important that happens here? Why is it important that the Americans win this fort? The cannons, they captured the heavy cannons, right? They needed cannons, they got cannons. That's why it's important. The kids were struggling, what's the why thing? The why is it important? Why does it matter? What's the point of that story? The Americans getting the cannons. They needed a little guidance on that. They were able to do it with a little guidance, but again, all the partners, that doesn't mean every individual was able to do that on their own, just so you know. And then we do exactly the same thing with the second part of the story. This is a little bit longer piece of story, but we're going to do exactly the same thing. We're going to, who is it about? Where did it happen? When did it happen? Same deal. It's no different. But now it's going to get interesting, at least in terms of what we want kids to learn. Because the question becomes, once you've got this one summarized and you've got this one summarized, what's the relationship between the two? What do the 2 events have to do with each other? So I just want to jump back. I don't want to go through this whole piece, but I want to show you a little of it. A month later, on the night of June 16th, British troops in Boston heard strange noises on nearby Charleston Peninsula. When the sun rose, they could not believe their eyes. The day before, the peninsula had been empty. Now its 2 small hills, Bunker Hill and nearby Breed's Hill, were alive with Americans. In just one night, they had built a fort of dirt and logs on Breed's Hill. The British knew they had to attack quickly. The Americans could drag the cannons taken at Fort Ticonderoga up to the hilltops. They'd be able to pound Boston and the British ships in the harbor. On the next day, 2,000 of the King's troops lined up, and so they fight with them. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. I thank thee, O Lord, for sparing me to fight this day. All that kind of heroic language. General Howe regrouped his men, sent them up the hill a 3rd time. Once more, the redcoat front line was ripped apart by gunfire. As soldiers in the back lines advanced, they tripped over their fallen comrades. But this time, the British troops reached the top. By now, the Americans had run out of gunpowder, were retreating to safer ground. The cannons captured at Fort Ticonderoga had never left New York. So now the question becomes, What's the connection between the two stories? What's the relationship? And I can tell you that the first thing the kids come up with is, this one happened first and this one happened second, right? It's just a sequential issue. And I can tell you from studies of at least middle school and high school social studies textbooks, if you guess that, you'll be right about 50% of the time. But they're not always in sequential order. Sometimes two things are happening simultaneously. Sometimes they tell things out of order to make the point that they're trying to make. In this case, they happen to be sequential, but that's not what the relationship is. That's not what the connection. So in the first section, we know the story. The second part, we know the story. What do the two stories have to do with each other? What do you think?
Well, they took the cannons and then the British got them back. And they were probably, I mean, the back and forth of war, you know.
Okay.
Cause and effect.
So the Americans captured the cannons, Ticonderoga, and then what happens at Bunker Hill? We get beaten, right? Americans get beaten. Why do they get beaten? What don't they have? They don't have cannons. Well, they eventually don't have gunpowder. But man, if they had cannons, no cannons. Why don't they have cannons? They left them in New York. That's kind of interesting. And now the third section, and we're not going to do this one at all. I just want to show you what it is. It's about the Second Continental Congress. And the Second Continental Congress figures out that they can't win this war if they don't somehow get the army organized. And so they pick a fellow by the name of Washington to head up the troops. The reason why the cannons don't get from New York to Massachusetts is those are separate armies. Massachusetts is a colony. New York is a colony. They don't, Massachusetts can't say to New York, send us your cannons. They don't have any control over that. The Congress does, and they exert the control by putting Washington in charge. And Washington then, he does something really crazy. He orders that they bring the cannons from New York to Boston and chases the British out. The key is the cannons. And so, this notion of, okay, now we've got this third thing, what are these guys going to do? Why are they going to do it? What's the connection? So the kids have to construct each of these connections. That's considerably harder than summarizing each piece, but it's that's what you really need to do to read history. You have to make those connections. If this author's telling me two stories, what's the connection between the two stories? Why has he aligned those? Now he's going to tell me a third. What does that do? And if you follow this one through, the argument is very much for a unified army, for a unified command, for the importance of the weapons and all, the stuff of war. I told you I had trouble understanding this. When we talked to the teachers who had been teaching this for some number of years, they said it was the first time they'd ever understood the chapter themselves. We looked at the teacher's guide. There's no explanation of it there, so it wasn't that, the textbook publisher had a handle on this, and we were just missing it. We literally had 10-year-olds explaining this chapter to the teachers and giving good historical arguments of what this guy's line of reasoning was, of this committee, whoever wrote this thing. And so essentially you relate each of those, and then you come up with a kind of an overall statement about what was that about. And these kids could explain to you. In fact, they were finding mistakes that people were making in their reading. They were getting the story to actually align in a useful way. And so when you read history, especially narrative history, when it's told in this kind of way, this connecting each of the events is something that authors sometimes do, but more often than not, they're going to put on your shoulders. Not in science, they won't do it like that. They don't really do it like that in literature. It's a different game, as you'll see. But in history, this is something that kids can start learning in as early as 4th or 5th grade, depending on the textbook or the materials that you have available, if you're going to have them read narrative history as opposed to other kinds of history. Very, very straightforward, the kind of thing that it actually, if I already put those standards up, but if we went back and looked, you'd see one of the things that the kids are supposed to learn to do by the time they leave your schools is to make those kinds of connections between the ideas in a historical account. And so they use a little different language than I'm using, and yet this is a way to teach that kind of thing. So it's not disconnected from the schools. And here you can see I filled one out. American Army had to be unified if they were going to win. It goes on from there. So that's one example of how even at elementary we can start introducing some of these disciplinary ideas that the kids actually have to master by the time they graduate high school. Another example, given one in science, I've given one in social studies. Let me give one in literature, and then I want to jump into the stuff I told you I was going to do with text. This is the one about theme. There are a ton of studies out there trying to figure out how to teach little kids about theme. And nobody has really come up with a very good way of doing it. The studies, unlike in most areas, they come back saying, gee, the kids by the end of their training couldn't do this any better than the kids who didn't get their training. And I think there's a reason for that. And I think this becomes a kind of antidote. And again, this is the kind of thing, yeah, you could teach this in high school, but what kids are supposed to do with this in high school is much more sophisticated. But this is a good thing, and again, could fit elementary. Now let me put it in context. I told you that I had two daughters. My youngest daughter, that science kid, was taking a high school literature class. And she, one evening at 9 o'clock, came to me with a homework question. Now, parents, how do you feel about 9 p.m. homework questions? Cool, huh? And she knew that. She could see that on my face, because I was into some TV show or something I wanted to watch, and here comes Megan with, hey, Dad, I have a question about my homework. And very quickly she said, no, Dad, you don't have to do anything. I just want you to, see if I got this right. So I said, okay, what is it? She says, in my English class, we're supposed to read a short story for homework, and I read the short story, and we have to come up with the theme, because in class we're going to write a thematic essay, and so that's the homework. And so I just want you to tell me whether I got the theme right. I said, well, honey, I can't possibly tell you if you got the theme right. I haven't read the story. She says, you don't need to. I said, really? What's the theme of the story? And she came up with something like, people do a lot of different things. And I said, no, that's not the theme. And she said, how do you know? You haven't read it. 15-year-olds, right? Who has 15-year-old kids? You know what I'm talking about. I'm not making that story up. So it's 10 after 9, and I'm reading the damn story. You've done this as parents. I'll bet you some of you have. And I'm reading this thing and trying to read it as fast, skimming through it. And the teachers picked out a wonderful story. It's a Morley Callahan story, Luke Baldwin's Vow. I've never seen this story before. Very nice story. The teacher's done a good job on this part of it. And by about 20 after, 25 after 9, frankly, I can see the theme of this story. It looks like it's up in neon lights that are flashing. And so now my voice is loud, because I'm unhappy. I'm a really wonderful father, but I'm angry. And I'm saying something along the lines of, Megan, how does your teacher teach you to, figure out theme? And she said, well, Dad, that's just it. They don't. They tell you what a theme is, and I know what a theme is. And then they have you try to figure out the theme of the story. And when you get that wrong, they tell you what the theme was. And that's supposed to help you next time, but it doesn't, because that story has a different theme. And I see a lot of nods, because that was, just the way that some of you were smirking and not. Guess what? I kind of did the same thing, because that was exactly how I was taught in school. And it doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. Instead of showing kids the way that we think, showing them that the way that people, disciplinary experts, approach these problems, we're just doing a school thing. Yeah, we do theme. We ask the theme question. If you're good at theme, you should be an English teacher someday. You're not so good at it, maybe you could go into one of the STEM fields. In other words, we sort the kids rather than trying to teach them. It is 25 after 9. I have two choices. I can tell Megan the theme, I can get back to my TV show, or I can try to teach it to her. And I'm good this night, I'm better than some nights. Fortunately, in my case, I had, not too long before this, taken a class at the University of Chicago that somebody gave me as a Christmas present. Now, this was not, this was a course, they paid my tuition to take a course in fiction writing. This was not a course on how do you teach fiction or something like that. It wasn't for educators. It was a course on how do you write the great American novel, essentially. The people in the class were all there to do just that they were going to start their writing careers. And this is quite a well-known class. A number of Chicago journalists, professional writers take the class when they decide it's time to write their novel. And so I'm in with all these people who are trying to write the great American novel, and I'm there because I got a Christmas present. One of the things that the teacher in this class taught us was how to put a theme into a story. And I figured if I knew how to put one in, I could get it back out again. And so I started asking Megan some questions about Luke Baldwin's vow. She knew a lot about the story, folks. She's not a bad reader. She just doesn't know how to figure out theme. And as her description of instruction was pretty apt, no one's helping her with that. And so essentially, the first thing I did was, this didn't exist. I created this the next day. The first thing I did is I started asking her about what the main character was like early in the story. And she could tell you that. She knew all about this boy, Luke. He was a boy a little bit older than her. He was a boy whose parents had just died recently. He'd been sent to live with an aunt and uncle who we'd never met before for some reason. His father had said something puzzling to him before he died. His father had said to him that, Luke, you should watch your uncle to find out the kind of man to be. And he didn't know, his uncle was a farmer. He didn't know if that meant, you should try to be a farmer or what he was telling him. He was very lonely. He didn't have any friends in this community because he just moved there, didn't know anybody. Well, he had one friend, an old dog on the property, an old farm dog. And the dog actually figures in the story. Luke is uncertain. He doesn't know what kind of life he's supposed to live. He's obviously afraid of it. He's certainly timid and so on. She could describe him very well. She didn't have any trouble with that. And then the question becomes, what's he like at the end of the story? Is he any different? Because what the scholars will tell you, what the literary experts will tell you, is when they figure out theme or when a writer builds a theme into a story, they do it on the basis of the arc of development of the character. Characters change across a story. In fact, that's the point of a story, to tell you how somehow the world is never going to be the same again. It's an event, but it's an important event. Luke is one way at the beginning of the story. He's quite different at the end. And there's something that changes him. There's a crisis. There's an event, or a series of events that change him. She could tell you all of these pieces. She could tell you, for example, that the crisis was that his uncle decides that the dog has to be put away because he can't work anymore. And Luke is going, the dog's my friend. You can't kill my friend. Shouldn't we be loyal to this dog? Uncle wants to get rid of him. In fact, one day he says to Luke, I'd like you to run an errand for me. Get on your bike and go into town and take care of this. And the kid is about to do it. He calls the dog and he says, no, you leave the dog here. I want you to do this quickly. You go right in with it. The kid knows something's up, suspects it. He disobeys, he circles back, and sure enough, here's the hired man taking the dog out and with a rock tied around his neck and throws it into the pond. And Luke breaks all he jumps in and he gets the dog, he pulls him out. And he goes to a neighbor's farm And he says to the neighbor, "Can I keep my dog here for the next few days until I figure something out?" The neighbor says, "Well, what's going on? Tell me what this is about." He tells the story. The neighbor says, "Okay." He says, "Do you want to keep that dog, Luke?" Luke says, "Yeah." He says, "Okay, here's what you do. First of all, are you willing to muck my barn out in the afternoon after school?" Kid says, "Sure." He says, "I'll tell you what, I'll pay you $1/4 a day to do that. Now I want you to get on that bike and ride home, and you say to your uncle," and you use these exact words, you say, "Uncle, I have a business proposition for you." And offer to board the dog, to pay to keep him, pay his upkeep. Luke does what he's told. He gets on the bike, he rides, he tells his uncle. His uncle says, "Where would you get money?" Tells him about his job. He says, "Okay, Luke, this will be a good lesson for you. I'm going to teach you how easy it is to separate a fool from his money. I'm going to let you keep that dog and pay for his board." And that's the day that Luke Baldwin makes a vow. He comes to a position, he knows who he wants to be, what he's going to be. And his vow is he's always going to have $1 in his pocket to protect himself from practical men. Right? He's never going to be in that kind of a situation where somebody can throw over friendship or loyalty or whatever just for money. Luke is a different character at the end of the story. He knows the reason why his father has never introduced him to this uncle before. He doesn't like him. He's figured out why his father wants him to watch the uncle. He wants him to not get a positive lesson. He wants him to learn, don't be like this. You can be better than this. Luke makes that decision. At the end of the story, this isn't a lost kid. This is a kid with a philosophy. He has a point of view. He knows who he is and who he wants to be. He's not afraid anymore. She could tell you all that stuff. The question is the change that Luke made a good change or a bad change? Would an author want you to try to be like Luke at the end? Or is it a lesson of, boy, don't do this? Is it positive or negative? Positive, right? So we got this positive lesson. And the theme is in that. And at about 9:45, Megan was able to tell me a really good theme for the story. And as she pointed out, she did it all by herself. The way teaching often works, I'm afraid. The point is teaching kids to think of this kind of a concept in the same way that a literary critic would, rather than the kind of school thing of, well, this is just one thing we do with a story, and so you're supposed to do it. Teaching it as a disciplinary insight or action that we can actually break down and explain and give you the reasons for it and how to do it. And as I say, one time I actually had to give this presentation and I was stunned. One of the people who has done a number of studies on teaching theme sat right in the front row and I thought, oh my God, I'm going to die. They're going to tear me apart. And the reaction was, this will work. This actually makes sense. This is the way to go. And so by high school, what you want, kids should be able to do more than what I just described. For example, what if a story has two characters that are going through an important change? They each have an arc of development. Doesn't that mean that more than one of those characters is going to have a theme? And in fact, it does. One of the things that we see in studies of high school is if a story has two characters that have important arcs of development, the teacher tends to pick the story they like best or the character that they feel most sympathetic to, and they evaluate the kids' work against that. And if the kids pick the other character as the one that they think is really the important one, like there's a study done of a Jessamine West story. It has these two sisters. And if the kids pick the older sister as who the theme is about, they're probably going to match up pretty well with the teacher. If they pick the younger sister as the one that they're most sympathetic with and most interested in, and they come up with a different theme for the story, guess what? Teacher marks them down for that because they got it wrong. And so what we want kids to be able to do, for example, can you come up with both themes of that story? Can you coordinate those two things? What do they have to do with each other? Do you think the author favors one of those themes over the other? What's the language in the text that would tell you that? And so on and so forth. And so this level of it, you guys could do in elementary school. You could start, setting this up in the primary grades. But by the time kids are in high school, they've got to do a lot more than just that. So fairly useful tool. So what can we do to get kids ready? Well, we can build basic literacy skills. We can develop the kids' content knowledge. We can expose them to disciplinary text. We can actually show them how to read that text, which is where we're going to go next. Certainly build up their vocabulary, working with multiple texts, teaching disciplinary writing. We talked a lot about that one. And introducing some of these disciplinary approaches. We don't have to wait if the text is there. Those pieces should be happening. Unfortunately, in so many schools around the country, those are not happening. That isn't what kids' experiences are. Oh no, we teach math and reading and that's where our focus is, and we kind of shift away from all this. Big mistake. We need to, if we're really serious about making kids really good readers, we're going to have to find ways of doing these things. So, with that said, give me just a second here to I want to move. Come on. Oh, come on, let me close. I need to get my other file open. Bingo. They're making this hard for me. There we go. Oh, good. Okay, and I need this one. And I'm going to also do some skipping around in this one, but not quite as much once we get into the meat of it. Okay. And this, there we go, from the computer, bingo. And if it's there it is. Okay. I don't need to tell you that. I don't need to tell you that. I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to skip that and that. Oh, I'll go right there. The state of Michigan, about 10 years ago, adopted a set of standards, the Common Core State Standards, you and 40 plus other states. I helped write those standards, so I think I know a little bit about them. There's some parts of those standards that haven't actually been put into place for various reasons. Maybe I will go back and show you a little of this. Probably the most basic item that has been neglected is the one about text complexity. If you go back and you look at those Common Core standards, what you're going to find is that they, just like past Michigan education standards, they set a bunch of skills and strategies and stuff that boys and girls are supposed to be able to do in reading, right? They're supposed to find key ideas and details. They're supposed to be able to summarize text. They're supposed to be able to do a whole bunch of things. But they all end in grades 2 through 12 with a 10th standard that says you have to be able to do those things with a particular level of book. You have to be able to do it with books that have particular Lexile levels or ATOS levels or whatever. When we look at those standards versus what's going on in the school, so for example, the RAND Corporation conducted a nationwide survey of elementary and secondary teachers in grades in 2016. 77% of the elementary teachers in the United States thought that teaching students with text at their reading levels was aligned with the standards. It's not really the case. The state actually sets specific standards that the kids are supposed to be able to read the text. 45% of the secondary teachers believe this. Only about a third of the elementary teachers and half the secondary teachers thought that they should assign grade level text for their classes to read. Teachers who knew the standards were less likely to use leveled readers, but of course most teachers don't know the standards. More recent survey, this one done by the Fordham Foundation, following up a survey that I did in 2010 for them. They did a national survey in 2018. These were of upper elementary teachers, middle school teachers, and the first half of high school teachers. And on the survey that I did, there was a particular question. How do you select the books that you teach reading with? Do you do it by grade level? Do you do it by reading level? Do you do it by interest? Do you, some combination of those? Please fill in the blank. Do you have some other scheme? Please fill in the blank, that kind of thing. And the vast majority of elementary teachers at the time, something over 60% of them said that they tried always to teach at reading level. About a third of the middle school teachers said that. About a quarter of the high school teachers said that. In 2018, when they went back and looked at this, what they found was that even larger percentages of teachers had moved over and decided that they needed to teach kids at their reading levels rather than their grade levels, despite the standards. And so the state adopted these standards with the idea of moving the kids into harder books. And the response of teachers was, let's move them into easier books. Pretty weird stuff. Let's think about this for a moment. These standards historically have given you a whole bunch of things kids are supposed to do with reading. But they don't tell you anything about how hard the texts have to be. If you go back and look at any of the standards before Common Core, they just tell you about the skills, they don't tell you about the text. Well, let's just imagine, let's go back to the 1970s when Michigan first started putting standards in place. Let's say that instead of having reading standards, they decided to have weightlifting standards for you. Let's imagine that they decided that kids in Michigan didn't need to know how to read, they needed to know how to lift weight. We would have written standards that might say things like kindergartners have to be able to do arm curls. And our standards in reading have been pretty repetitive, and so we probably say first graders need to do arm curls, and fifth graders need to do arm curls. The same way we say kindergartners have to draw inferences, and fifth graders have to draw inferences, and eighth graders have to draw inferences. Has anybody noticed I've done an amazing number of arm curls? What's wrong with my arm curls? I heard those laughs. That's impolite, but okay. What's wrong with my arm curls? No weight. If I had weight on here, I couldn't do this. The fact is, no one looking at weightlifting would say it makes any sense if you don't know how many repetitions and how heavy. Right? It wouldn't make any sense. It's the same thing with reading. Saying that you're going to draw inferences or summarize text or identify key ideas and not telling me how hard the text is pretty bizarre. And so from grades 2 through 12 in Michigan, at every level of reading from 2 through 12, what they say is, yeah, you have to find key ideas and details, you have to be able to recognize different points of view when you're reading, you have to be able to do all these things, evaluate the text. And the text that you do those things with have to be this hard, and they specify readability levels, text levels of the text. Why did they do that? Two big reasons. One, boys and girls are leaving our schools as high school students, having met our standards, but not able to fully participate in our society. The typical high school graduate in places like Michigan goes off to, something like 70% of them go off to college, might be slightly higher in this community. And roughly 55% of those boys and girls need remedial work when they're in college. Think about that. And in fact, a very substantial percentage of those kids will not finish the first year of college because they don't read well enough. But they passed all our standards. So the notion was we had to get kids to higher levels of text. That's one reason. And so it's distressing to hear now that we have those higher standards, teachers are going to teach with even easier text. I'll show you why that is. Second, I said two reasons. The other reason is not just the aspirational level of what we want for our kids. The other thing we figured out is, frankly, these reading skills that we focus so much attention on in standards aren't helping kids to read any better. That we're focused on the wrong thing here. That we're focusing on these skills rather than on the texts themselves. And let me show you the kind of evidence, the kind of reason why we would conclude that. Now, I'm going to show you data from a particular study about a particular test that's never been designed. The fact of the matter is, this is from the ACT, the college testing folks. And what's summarized here are data from about 500,000 high school juniors. Every study that's been done since about 1945 finds the same thing, so this is not anything unique here. Essentially, what they've done here is, well, let me just explain what the chart is. First of all, these are the kids' ACT scores along here. So if you're a kid who gets like 17 on the ACT, your data will be up above that 17. Here is the percentage correct on the reading comprehension portion of the ACT. And so if you get, say, 50% right, your data are going to be someplace in that line. So they're going to show you, the relationship. And not surprisingly, the kids with the lowest ACT scores get the lowest comprehension, and it goes up, higher and higher. I know this is a very big room, and this is a small screen. Can you see that there are two lines there? That there are two lines being summarized. One of those lines shows you how the kids do on the literal recall items. These are like the author writes something explicitly, and all you have to do is find it or remember it. And the other one are all those higher order thinking items, the ones where you have to interpret or draw inferences or put information together. What do you notice about the two lines? They're the same. They're really close, aren't they? In fact, they're so close. Those spaces that you can see, the statisticians tell us it's just statistical noise. There's no difference. There's no difference at any point. Not with the lowest readers, not with the average readers, not with the superstars. There's absolutely no variation in this. Kids perform exactly the same on those different kinds of items. Now, ACT should have known that because, as I told you, it's been found with every other test. But they didn't give up. They decided to break their tests out. Main idea questions, supporting details questions, relationships among characters or relationships among ideas questions, vocabulary questions. At every level, the kids perform exactly the same on all of those. How kids do in those different skills makes absolutely no difference in how they perform. In so many school districts, teachers are told, use your data. In other words, take these test data, see which kinds of items the kids don't answer the questions well on, and teach them those skills like crazy. So have them do a lot of main idea if they got the main idea questions wrong here, and that'll make them better readers. And that doesn't work, actually. That's a foolish way to use those data, because what this is showing is those questions make zero difference. They pick up none of the variance. So if we spend a lot of time trying to teach kids those skills that are supposedly going to help them, no difference whatsoever. Now, ACT, again, they don't give up. They sure stuck with it, thank goodness. They think what they wanted to see here, they want these lines to jump apart, folks. If they can get these lines to jump apart, they can give you something to do instructionally. In this case, since this is a high school level test, they'd be able to say to high school teachers, if your kid gets an 18 on the ACT and you want to get them a higher reading score, here are the items you should teach them. That's not what they found, though. They couldn't get the lines to jump apart until they tried something else. And now you can see that the lines really do jump apart. Well, not at the ends, not down here and not up here, but for the 95% of us in between those extremes, the lines really jump apart. Well, what did they do? What are they summarizing there? It's not the performance on the different skills, it's the performances on the different levels of text. What they did is they didn't use Lexiles or any of the readability schemes. They came up with some rubrics, and they had teachers read the articles and sort them into 3 groups on the basis of how sophisticated the vocabulary is, how complicated the sentences were, how complicated the text organization was, whether there were some of those graphic devices in the text, whether there were literary devices in the text. And teachers literally sorted these into uncomplicated, straightforward, plain language text to more challenging, somewhat more complicated text, to very complex text. And when they sorted them like that, what they found was the lines really jumped apart. Now, again, not at the lowest level. Those lowest readers, remember, ACT doesn't go in with test, they don't go in with second grade level text and stuff. They're trying to find out who's going to do well in college, so they might have 9th and 10th, grade texts and so on. Those kids, it doesn't seem to matter how easy some of the texts were, they couldn't handle anything in that universe of text. They might be able to handle easier text, but not those. And these superstars up here didn't seem to matter how hard any of the texts were. They could answer anything. All the texts were easy for them, apparently. But for everybody else, what makes a difference in reading comprehension is how well you can actually read the text. And so their suggestion was what high schools needed to do, and I'm going to say in elementaries too, is you should have kids reading harder text to teach them how to handle the language demands of harder text. Don't worry about the questions. Don't try to ask certain kinds of questions. Don't worry about all that stuff. Worry about whether you can make sense of the text. What does a reading comprehension test measure? Reading comprehension. It doesn't measure any of those skills. So we've been teaching the wrong stuff. What I'm suggesting to you is that reading comprehension isn't the ability to answer certain kinds of text questions. It's the ability to make sense of the ideas that are expressed in a text. It's the ability to negotiate the linguistic and conceptual barriers or affordances. That's why when we were talking at lunch about teaching kids to handle the language, it's not just, can we give them some kind of a general lesson in grammar? Can we actually teach them to understand particular sentences? It makes sense, I hope, in this context. The ability to negotiate linguistic and conceptual barriers or affordances of a text. Authors do things to try to increase their readers' understanding. For example, in a science text, authors might provide scientific definitions of the concepts that they're going to present. Do our kids know how to make sense of the scientific definitions? Do we understand what goes into a scientific definition? Do the kids understand? Is anybody breaking that down for them, or is it just, well, they either get it or they don't? And I'm afraid too often it's they either get it or they don't. If they're talented at this, if they're smart, if someone at home will do this for them, great. If not, oh well, they maybe won't get there. Reading comprehension instruction needs to focus more on making sense of text than on reading comprehension skills. Unfortunately, most elementary teachers believe that students have to learn to read with text at their instructional level. How many of you were taught at the university that you're supposed to teach kids with instructional level text? Nobody? Really? There's a hand. Good. One person. The fact is, that's everybody's curriculum. That's not something that's unique. This belief is fostered by teacher education and is reinforced by most commercial reading programs. They build it, everybody's got to, test these kids and find out what their levels are, and match them to the books, and then they'll learn to read. That's, so much of reading workshop is that kind of thing. The kids, you're going to get different bins of books. You get to be in the blue bin. You can't go into the red bin. That's too hard for you. That kind of stuff. The fact is, when kids are confronted with text that's hard to understand, teachers do one of four things, or some combination of these. This isn't from research, this is from my own personal observations over the years. Certainly the most popular thing to do, the one that's most widely recommended by the authorities in reading, is to move kids to an easier text. This text is hard for her, I'm going to put you in something that's at your level, that kind of thing, right? Let's come back to that one. I already said it's very popular. Well, let's just do one thing with it. Let's say she's a 5th grader. She can't read the 5th grade text easily, so I want to teach her out of a 3rd grade text or a 4th grade text. Do you believe that's going to help her to read the 5th grade text better? Obviously it might do something, but it won't do that because she won't be working with the 5th grade text. Fair enough. Just want to get that on the table. A second really popular one, this text is hard for my kids. I read it to them. I think you see that with the social studies books and the science books, sometimes even with the reading books. I went into a classroom once, was going to observe what I thought was a guided reading lesson, and got in, and the teacher was doing like a read aloud to the boys and girls. And I thought, well, maybe I'd screwed up the schedule, or I was like, the reason she was doing a read aloud is that text was hard for the kids. So instead of having them, teaching them to read it, she was reading it to them. She was going to get them the information. She wasn't going to make sure that they were learning to read the text. It was actually their reading textbook. It was absolutely bonkers. And again, reading the text to you will certainly give you the information, but it won't teach you how to read that text. Third one, especially popular in the upper grades, just tell the kids what the text says. Tomorrow I'll be going up one side and down the other side of your high school and middle school science teachers in the district, because quite often what those teachers do is they have a textbook, but they choose not to use it. They'll say things like, well, the book is hard for the kids to understand. I can tell them everything they need to know. I know what's going to be on the exams. I know what's in the standards. I can tell them what they need to know, and if they want to read the text, they can. And I can tell you they don't want to read it, so they won't. And so again, I'd say that, again, will get them the information. It won't teach them how to read it. And if they don't read in 9th grade science, and 10th grade science, and 11th grade science, what makes you think when they go off to college and take Science 101 that they're not going to end up in a remedial class? Not because they can't read, because they have no idea how to read science, because even though you have a very good high school, they haven't read any for 3 or 4 years. That's not a good idea. I used to tell people, yeah, we see that in math and you see that in science, but you'd never see it in literature. I'm now seeing it in literature courses. People are literally saying, I will tell you this story, you don't have to read it. This is nuts. This is not a good way to go. And the fourth way is you just ignore the problem. You assign the readings, and when the kids are done, you call on Statue of Liberty girl, you know, the one whose arm is always up in the harbor, and you just kind of move on. And the fact that some of you couldn't do it is not my problem. I hope it's clear to you that none of those 4 things make kids better readers. Not one of those works. They solve your immediate problem. Man, some of my kids can't do this right now. How can I get around this problem? What's a good workaround? I'll tell them what it says. That way they don't need to read it. I'll read it to them. That way they don't need to read it. I'll find something easier for them to read. That'll solve my problem. But it actually doesn't solve theirs. It doesn't actually teach them anything. And so the choices that we're making make sense, but only if what you're trying to do is just get through the lesson and not teach the kids what they need to know. The idea of teaching, I said I was going to come back to this, the idea of teaching kids to read with more complex text flies in the face of this instructional level idea. The basic idea of the instructional level has been that kids learn to read best from texts that are relatively easy for them. If I assign you text that you can already read well, you'll like it, you'll learn from it, and everything is going to be fine. Experts have claimed that if the books are too hard, students will not be able to learn, and consequently there are many schemes for placing kids in text levels and for teaching with instructional level text. That's what informal reading inventories are about. That's what running records are about. That's what STAR tests are about, and so on and so forth. There are just a ton of these schemes. The fact is, this notion of grouping kids for instruction on the basis of text level was even a common practice 100 years ago. I found a 1918 survey of teachers, and more than half of them indicated that they were teaching multiple groups and reading with different levels of books. And this predates all the science people coming in with the research and stuff. Reading experts 100 years ago would say that it was important to teach kids at their level, but they wouldn't tell you what that meant. They didn't have any kind of a scheme for it. They just basically you had to do that. That changed in the 1940s. A fellow by the name of Emmett Betts is the guy who came up with the idea that everybody has an instructional level, an independent level, and a frustration level. He's the one who came up with the criteria that an instructional level text was a text that you could read with 95% accuracy if you were reading it aloud. That would mean if you read a 100-word portion, you'd make no more than 5 oral reading mistakes. and you'd be able to answer 75 to 89% of the questions. That would be your comprehension level of it. And he was saying that if you match kids to text at those levels, then they would do better in reading. They would learn more. That would be the optimum placement for those boys and girls. And he claimed that the research supported this, that this was the way to go. And for the last 70 years, this is what we've been telling folks in reading courses, what we've been building into programs, what people are doing more and more even today. I am going to try to do 2 slides faster than I've ever done them, because this is going to be the end of the research. When I get through these 2 slides, I'm talking nothing but instruction the rest of the way. The first study by Kilgallen was the study that Betts was referring to when he said that research supported this idea of teaching kids at their optimum levels, their instructional levels. He claimed that this study showed that if you taught kids at these levels, they'd do better. This study was actually a doctoral dissertation that one of his students did. And what they had done is they'd taken a small group of 4th graders, tested their oral reading, and asked them questions about the text. What they were looking for is how many oral reading errors the kids could make and still get that 75 to 89% comprehension. That was it. That was what the study was. They didn't place anybody in any particular books. They didn't try to teach them. They didn't teach kids at different levels to see what would happen. They never tried it. But they concluded this was the instructional level. Years later, when they were interviewed about it, and people said, well, where did the 75 to 89% comprehension come from? They said they couldn't remember. They probably just made it up. This was the basis of what we do in most classrooms in the United States. Powell did a very similar set of studies, several such studies. He actually thought this was a good way of determining the instructional level. He just thought that Kilgallen and Betts messed it up. So what Powell did is very similar kind of study, but with kids 1st grade through 8th grade, and much larger samples of kids, much more diverse samples of kids. And he found out 2 things. He found out, one, that there was, if you did it that way, there wasn't one reading level, there were several instructional reading levels that, in other words, at different grade levels, you'd come up with different numbers. And 2, he found that kids could, at some levels, could tolerate quite a bit of disfluency and still get high comprehension. And so that Betts was putting kids in books that were much too easy. And so he claimed that he had to place kids in much harder books. Powell was always cited as a kook because he got the different numbers than Betts did, even though he did the better studies. Duncan was one of Powell's students. He did a really interesting 2nd grade study. He found out what books the teachers were going to work with the 2nd graders. He tested the kids and figured out what their levels were in the books that they were being taught from. And at the end of the year, he tested the kids to see how much learning they did. He wanted to correlate the book placements with the learning. Just a correlational study. He wanted to know which children, which placements led to the greatest amount of learning. What he found was not the instructional level. He found that if kids were put in books where they were making maybe 15 to 20 mistakes per 100 words, and their comprehension was well below 50%, those kids made the biggest gains in reading in 2nd grade. They learned more. In other words, what Betts was saying, don't do, this is frustration level. This will block the kids from learning. Those were the kids who were actually making the biggest reading gains. We were holding the kids back, not moving them forward. That study's never been cited in our field. Jorgensen did a very similar study, found no relationship between, he worked for 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. He found no relationship between these placement levels and how much the kids were learning. All that testing and placing and so on was making no difference. McNamara with middle school kids found that they learned more from content text that were hard for them than from instructional level text. Morgan, in the year 2000, 54 years after we started telling teachers that you have to teach kids at instructional level, somebody decides, why don't we test this out? Why don't we do an experiment on this? Morgan takes a bunch of 2nd graders, she tests them with an informal reading inventory, finds out their reading levels using Betts' criteria, and then she randomly assigns the children to 3 groups. Your group over here along this wall You're gonna be placed at your instructional level. So if you read at a second grade level, I'll put you in the second grade book, just like the theory says. You guys in these middle two rows, you're just like them. Remember, random assignment. I'm going to put you 2 grade levels above your instructional level. So if you read at a second grade level, you get to work in a 4th grade book. You guys along this wall, we're going to put you 4 grade levels above your reading level. So you read at a second grade level, we're going to put you in the 6th grade book. And we know how this is supposed to come out. You guys along this wall should really learn a lot because you're placed at the appropriate level. You guys might learn something, but clearly frustration level, they probably won't learn anywhere near as much as you guys. And these kids will burn the school down. Well, then everybody knows they're not only not going to learn, they're going to be behavior problems because they're going to be so frustrated from being in a hard tech. You know that. They do this for a school year. They come back and test everybody. You'll be pleased to know all the groups made some learning gains. You guys who were so perfectly placed, sorry to tell you, you made the smallest gains of anybody. You learned less than everybody else. You guys learned everything they did in almost 3/4 of another school year's level. You moved that far. And you guys that I said were going to be such a disaster, you didn't do as well as that middle group. You certainly did better than those sluggards over there. You were actually almost exactly halfway in between the 2 groups. The conclusion of the study was placing kids at instructional level, lowering their achievement because it was cutting off their opportunity to learn. These kids are getting exposed to text elements, language, content that is moving, is allowing them to learn. These guys aren't even being exposed to it. That study used to not be cited. Now people cite it grudgingly and say, yeah, but those teachers can't really scaffold the way that they scaffolded in those studies. It'd be too hard for regular teachers to do this. So let me just take a moment to tell you what they did. This was paired reading. The scaffolding wasn't done by a teacher, it was done by other 7-year-olds, untrained 7-year-olds at that. Do you guys think you could scaffold as well as a 7-year-old? I bet you can. It's silly stuff. Brown did the same, she replicated that Morgan study with 3rd grade learning comprehension, all the stuff we talked about earlier. 3 groups. 1 group, you're going to be my controls this time. You're not going to get tutored. We're just going to leave you alone. We've tested you, you're in the group, but you're not going to get assigned to a tutoring. You guys in the middle, you're going to get tutored at your grade level. So if you're a 3rd grader, I don't care how low you're reading, you're going to work in a 3rd grade textbook. And you guys are gonna, if you're gonna get placed at your instructional level. And so if you read like the kids there, they're gonna be put at their grade level, you're gonna be put at your reading level. So you might be in a 1st grade book or, that kind of thing. Okay. They do this for a length of time, they come back, they test. The tutoring kids do better than the kids who weren't tutored. That's a good, the instruction's working, that's good. We'd like to know that. But unlike what Morgan and Brown found, what O'Connor reports is that the kids placed at their instructional level actually made somewhat better gains in the foundational skills in phonics and fluency, not in comprehension, but in phonics and fluency, which is important, than the kids in these groups, in this middle group. The kids placed at grade level. She goes through her data quite carefully in this particular study. And she says that the difference between these 2 groups is mediated by the lowest kids. And so, the high readers, those kids reading like high 1st grade or beginning 2nd grade levels, there wasn't much difference between those, but for those beginning readers, those really low readers, there was this better foundational benefit. Second thing you need to know, one is that certainly that it was only helping the lowest kids. The second thing you need to know is she goes back a while later and she says, there's something about this study that bothers me. We observed the teaching and we noticed that there was a pattern, that the teachers in this group were responding to kids' oral reading errors differently than the teachers in this group. There are lots of different ways you can respond to errors, and that she was concerned that that might be a confound, that might be part of the reason why there was a difference. So she decided in 2010, let's go back and redo this study. We'll get another group of third, fourth, and fifth graders, and we'll test them. We'll do all the stuff the same. The difference is we're going to train all the teachers to respond to the errors in the same way, to take that away as an explanation. And she does that study, and she finds no difference in performance for the kids in these two groups. It didn't matter if the kids were at grade level or at instructional level, they learned about the same amount. Now, I shared that a while back in Ohio with a group of dyslexic high school kids who cheered that finding. And when I asked them what they were cheering about, they said, "You're saying we don't have to work in the stupid books anymore." Because it didn't make any sense to these kids if they were getting no reading benefit from it. Why would you move me to an easier text that's below my cognitive level, different than my curiosity and interest in the world, and that cuts me off from my peer group? Why would you do such a thing unless it helps? And your studies are saying it doesn't help. And I don't have a good explanation for them, but I promised them I would tell you that. Melanie Kuhn and her colleagues did a series of studies. I've got the first one listed here, where they tried their fluency-oriented reading instruction, or FORI, up against guided reading. In FORI, you teach the boys and girls at their instructional level. In guided reading, you teach kids at their reading level. They did this in second grade. They did this in third grade. Very large study. What they found quite consistently is the kids did better working with the grade level text than they did working with the instructional level text. And the sixth grade study found that having kids working at the instructional level text gave them no advantage over placing them in text a year above their instructional level. And this study done in high school found that grade level text led to as much learning as easier text with ninth graders, as long as there was instructional support for the kids. What I'm telling you is every single study that's been done on this topic has found one of two things. Either moving kids to their instructional level it doesn't help at all, doesn't change anything for the kids. Or two, it's actually doing damage, it's holding them back. It's stopping them from learning, it's taking away their opportunity to learn. If we're going to get kids to high enough levels that your middle school and high school teachers are going to be able to say, have them read a science book or a social studies book, we've got to end this practice of teaching kids a year or 2 or 3 years behind their grade level. We've got to start actually teaching them to handle those more complex texts instead of putting them in text that frankly the kids can read rather well already. Let's face it, if you can answer 75 to 90% of the questions on a cold read, you're probably reading that text adequately and we can move on. Instead of, oh, that's the level I would like to teach you at. In other words, we're doing it wrong. So the question is, what do we need to do? How can we deal with this? And I wanted to skip through this and tell you that in fact there are a ton of studies showing that we can teach kids, we can scaffold kids to help them to understand text. And I want to grab a few of these to show you. Let's do this one. Let's start with vocabulary. The reason I'm going to start with vocabulary is it's a scaffold that pretty much everybody gives. Teachers give it, most textbooks recommend it. What I'm talking about is the text is going to use vocabulary that the youngsters don't know. So there's a distance between the book level and the kids level. What can we do about that? And what most people have hit on, what if I familiarize kids with the words that they're not likely to know ahead of time? Won't that make the kid more like the text? And the answer is yes, and it works. And we've got studies showing it. I don't think we do this one well, but it works. And so what I want to suggest to you, look, well, I've got a passage here, and I've swiped this from a 4th grade book. Photosynthesis may sound like a big word, but it's actually pretty simple. You can divide it into 2 parts. It goes on, gives an explanation of photosynthesis and so on. If you look at that text, and the question I have for you is, anyone want to venture a guess at the words that the publisher might ask you to pre-teach? think I heard it. Say it again.
Photosynthesis.
Anybody guess photosynthesis? That's dumb. Why would we pre-teach a word that the author's going to define in the text? Are you the kind of person that feels like when somebody's telling a joke, you have to jump in with the punchline before they get to it? It doesn't make any sense. If the author is going to explain what photosynthesis is, the comprehension job that the kids have is to try to understand how that explanation works, to make sense of that definition. And if you tell them ahead of time, there's absolutely no reason to read this text. So if you look at science books, quite often they'll say, gee, in this chapter, there are 10 concepts that the chapter is going to introduce and teach. Here are the 10 concepts. Tell the kids what those are before they read about them. Kids are getting smart about this. They're just not reading it. They sit there. They wait. They turn pages and wait for you. Because they know if they just tell you back what you told them, you'll be happy. And they won't confuse themselves with all that darn reading. So I would suggest a rule. And my rule is, if the author's going to define a word, you don't tell them what that word means before the author does. You let the kids. That's a good comprehension question. Kids, what's photosynthesis? Why is it important? That's very reasonable. They didn't get it, let's go back and look at the text again. But the notion of, well, I'll tell them what it says and then I'll have them read it. Why read it? You've just taken away the reason. This I've lifted out of a 5th grade text from someplace. Some scientists argue that these gases have heated up our atmosphere. They say global warming will affect our climate so dramatically that glaciers will melt and sea levels will rise. In addition, it's not just our atmosphere that can be polluted. Oil from spills often seeps into the ocean. Now, I've highlighted 3 words. These aren't from the publisher. I've highlighted 3 words. None of these words are defined in the text. Do you think kids could figure out the meanings of any of these words on the basis of context?
Yeah.
See some nods. How about glaciers? You think they can get glaciers?
Yeah.
Then I'm going to suggest that we not pre-teach glaciers. I don't care if the textbook says it or if you say, I don't think the kids know what a glacier is. I don't care if you think you can get it from context. Why do they think that you can? Well, because it says glaciers will melt. That tells me something about what they might be made out of, right? Sea levels will rise. Well, gee, if they melt in the sea level, they must be big. You know, they're probably really big pieces of ice. That tells me something. So I think you're right. There isn't a reading program on the market that doesn't probably have 4 worksheets in it that you get to about mid-year about how you use context to figure out word meanings. That's really nice. I'm not against those worksheet pages, but I'm going to suggest this is a much more important part of reading than that. And what we ought to be doing with a text like this is have the kids read it. And one of my questions, I'm not going to tell them what a glacier is ahead of time. I think these folks who were nodding and say, yeah, glaciers will get it. I agree with them. You're not nuts. I'm on your page. If you think that they couldn't get it, then you pre-teach it. That would make some sense. But we think they can. So I'm not going to pre-teach glaciers, but it becomes a comprehension question then. Yeah, but the textbook doesn't ask it. I don't care. I'm going to ask it. I want to see if they got it. If they don't know what a glacier is, if they can't tell me what a glacier is having read this page or this chapter, guess what? We got to go back to the text. We're going to look at that context. We're going to reread. We're going to show these kids how to do this on a day-to-day basis with real text. And you can even do this at a distance. This can be, even over the computer, where you would take the kids back. Let's look at that page again and see if we can make sense of it. You missed it the first time. We can figure this out. Another issue, and this is a text that overshoots you guys a little bit, but it's the same point. Some of you know Isabel Beck's vocabulary scheme, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Right? Tier 1 words are words that kids just pick up in normal oral language. Tier 3 are specialized words like rhombus and things like that probably don't have very high frequency in the written language and certainly are very specialized. They belong to a particular subject matter. Tier 2, the sweet spot for reading, is those words that aren't frequent in oral language, but come up a lot in written text and don't belong to a single subject area. So you might see it in pretty much any text you see. We do a lot of focus on that in deciding what vocabulary words to teach. And sadly, we do the same thing when we're trying to decide which words to introduce. So I've got several words highlighted here, but let's just focus on two of them for the moment. We're going to focus on cauldron and we're going to focus on calving. I can never forget the scene that met us. Between us and the barrier was a lane of some 50 yards wide, a seething cauldron. Bergs were calving off as we watched and capsizing and hitting other bergs, splitting into two and falling apart. I can tell you right now that if a middle school anthology had this text in it, I will bet you dollars to donuts that the publisher or the authors are going to say, we need to pre-teach cauldron. And the reason, because cauldron's a tier 2 word. Cauldron comes up with some frequency. You might see cauldron in social studies. You might see it in science. It might come up in literature, so it doesn't belong to a subject matter. It's an important word. It's valuable. It's on ACT's academic word list. It's worth teaching. But look at that sentence. If you couldn't read the word cauldron or didn't know what it meant, does it really make much difference in your understanding of what's going on in the text? If it were smeared, you just couldn't read the word. Now let's look at calving. Calving is definitely not an important word. Calving is not high frequency. It won't come up much in kids' reading. There are only two fields of study that even deal with it: glacier study and animal husbandry. So calving is not one of those words, oh, we got to make sure kids learn that or they can't get into the University of Michigan. Want to bet? But again, look at it in the sentence. And if you know that calving refers to smaller parts of the glacier breaking off the larger part, looking like a baby calf falling off the mother cow when it's being born, it actually helps you to understand what's going on in the text. It doesn't have the same level of redundancy that cauldron does. When it comes to teaching kids vocabulary and trying to build up kids' vocabulary, I'm 100% on the side of people who would teach cauldron. But if I'm trying to prepare kids to handle this text that I think is going to be hard for them, I want to present words that are going to make a difference to their understanding the text. And let's not worry about the long term. Let's worry about today. Let's worry about this text. And so I would pre-teach calving, but I would not pre-introduce cauldron. I wouldn't take the time. There's too many other things to do here. Let me make this as clear as I can. If you have a word wall where the kids keep a vocabulary notebook, where you give kids vocabulary quizzes on Friday, cauldron's the word. If we're trying to prepare kids for reading this hard text that they're going to struggle with, calving. I'm going to introduce calving. The one I'm going to spend a lot of time on later will be cauldron, but right now I'm going to give the kid a leg up on this text because that's the problem that confronts the youngster. And the last thing I have for you on this is this heading here, tell vocabulary. Doesn't say teach vocabulary, doesn't say pre-teach vocabulary. I told you this morning about that study we did where we did more than observations in more than 1,000 classrooms. I have come to believe that there is no more boring time during a school day than when teachers are pre-teaching vocabulary to get them ready to read a text. Got video of 4-year-old preschoolers when the teacher says, oh, we're about to read this, let me introduce the vocabulary. And these kids, you have the most world-weary looks you've ever seen on a 4-year-old, rolling their eyes, oh my God, here we go again. When I visit middle schools, it is not uncommon that I'll go in to see a reading lesson, and the 45 minutes or 50 minutes of the lesson is all completely eaten up and the teacher pre-introducing vocabulary. Kids, what's a glacier? What do you think a glacier is? What's your guess? We don't need to do that. That's not useful. That fills time. That doesn't help kids learn. What if we do something really crazy, like if we want to introduce, I'm just going to familiarize you guys with it. A glacier is just like a big sheet of ice. A cauldron is just like a boiling pot. We're ready to go. Let's go. Photosynthesis is how plants eat. Let's move on with it. And frankly, at most of your grade levels, giving kids a written glossary. Boys and girls, there's some words in this text that I thought might trip you up. I put together a glossary. It's on the whiteboard, or here's a handout, or it's on your screen these days, I guess we would say. If any of the other words get in your way, just raise your hand and I'll come to you, or send me a post and I'll respond to you. They don't need all that support. They need give me the support so I have the words right there. I just got you 45 minutes of teaching time so we can actually work on this text in that example. So vocabulary is a great scaffold. It really works. It really helps. We're teaching the wrong words a lot of time, and we're sure spending way too much time on those. We're mixing up two things. We're mixing up teaching vocabulary and giving kids a scaffold to make sense of this text. Those are not the same thing. And sometimes they overlap. The word I want to teach is the word that's really going to trip them up here. Gee. Then I do all the stuff he said, and I follow up with lessons to make sure that that word sticks in the kid's memory. Fair enough. But it won't be 100% overlap, which is why I show you that. So that's one example of what I mean by scaffolding. Focus on words that make a difference in understanding the text. Don't focus on words explicitly defined. Don't focus on words that can be figured out from context. Do not provide extensive prior instruction. Just introduce the words. A glossary is enough. And obviously, we're going to build vocabulary from there. And I have some information here about morphology, because in fact, context is one thing, and morphology, learning how to break words down and use their parts, is another. That's another tool that's right in the text that we ought to be doing more with. Obviously, there's more to reading than the words. There's more to comprehension than just the words. Reading requires that you be able to make sense of syntax and grammar, how sentences are organized. This is a 5th grade example. I'm trying to sort of shoot those levels as much as possible. However, on August 24th, 2006, the International Astronomical Union, IAU, a group of individual astronomers and astronomical societies around the world, made an announcement. It's 25 words long, has 5 commas, has numbers, has an acronym, has parentheses. I'm going to bet that a typical 10 or 11-year-old kid in a 5th grade is going to have trouble understanding that sentence. Are there 5th grade teachers in the room? Anybody think I might be right on that? Not completely. I see some nods. People don't think I'm completely nuts on this. That's good. It matters that these examples be right. The reason I think it's going to be hard for kids, well, there are a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is it's so long. When we talk to each other, not, I'm lecturing today. When we talk to each other, we tend to keep our utterances to 5 to 7 words in length. I'm not going to overload your memory, right? You're not normally going to sit with your friends and talk and take notes. It's a different game. Linked to each other, which means they have to do some of that work, and I'm going to bet they don't do it. I accept that, but there's another little problem in this sentence. Can anybody find a verb? Made, yeah, the 23rd word in the sentence. The fact is, linguists tell us that when we interpret sentences, or what they refer to as propositions, when you interpret a proposition, you do it from the verb out. In other words, you find the verb. You don't know you're doing this. You do this tacitly. You find the verb, and then you start connecting the ideas to it. Do we have any German speakers or readers in the room? Well, then I can say anything. Good. In German, there are certain sentence constructions where the last word in the sentence will be the verb. I guess people tell me that's true of Latin too, and that's where the Germans got it. I don't know if that's true. But the last word in the sentence, and what that means is you have to hold the entire utterance in memory while you wait for the verb before you can start going. Somebody made some. Who made it? What did they make? When did they? That kind of thing. And so that's a problem. That's probably the first question I would ask the boys and girls. I would literally ask this. So let me set this up. Because I'm not going to give the kids this sentence. I'm not going to do what we were talking about with vocabulary. There's some words here I think you're going to have trouble with. I'm going to familiarize you with them ahead of time. With sentences, I'm going to suggest find those sentences that you think you're going to trip kids up and lie in wait. Let them trip them up. Let the kids struggle with it. And so, however you normally assign this kind of text. So let's say normally you had them read a page at a time. Do that. Don't draw their attention to this sentence. Just have them read the page. No, Tim, we don't do it that way in our class. We read sections. We read a whole section and then we talk. Okay, then have them read a section and then we'll talk about it. No, we read the entire selection and then however you normally do it, do that. But one of your questions needs to get at whether they understood this sentence. I'm not going to show them the sentence. I'm not going to go back and say, hey guys, on page 194, look at, I'm just going to say something crazy to them, like, what did the IAU do? Right? Very, very kids to see if they can find in his life. The subjects are so long now that the verbs get pushed all the way over to the right. It's changing the English language, but science is out there, and this has been a change that's been taking place over the last 50 years. The language is changing quite dramatically, and the verbs are moving further and further to the right, and kids aren't being taught how to deal with stuff like that. This is where your idea of linguistic study would make a little bit of sense, right? Here's one thing I might do with it. I might have this prepared for the kids. However, on 4th, 2006, and here's the subject, this blue part. The International Astronomical Union, IAU, a group of individual astronomers and astronomical societies around the world, made an announcement. You can see why that poor little verb gets lost. You don't like that? Okay, what if we do this? We're going to go back and we're going to read and reread that sentence. Who was it about? Who are they? What did they do? What did they make? When did they do? Literally getting these kids to read and reread that sentence so that they can start to figure out how you do that. So there's not one way to do these things. Another example. This is a 4th grade example. Women of Montgomery, both younger and, well, let me start again. The women of Montgomery, both young and older, would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments, or their Sunday suits and blouses that needed just a touch, a flower, or some velvet trim, or something to make the ladies look festive. 44 words long, 2 commas and an M dash, and my bet is a typical 9-year-old asked to read that story is going to get the heebie-jeebies, and a typical 9-year-old boy is going to say he doesn't care. Now, this is really a nice piece of literature. It's awards. It's about Rosa Parks. So that's an important thing. But that's a killer sentence. And I don't want to avoid it. I want the kids to actually read it. I want them to try to understand it. And so again, I'm going to do what I suggested in the first example. I need a question to reveal to me whether the kids understood this sentence or not. Well, Tim, this doesn't fit the Common Core. You're asking some other kinds of questions. I'm trying to find out if the kids can read the text. That's all I want to know. And so I know this is a hard sentence. I want to know if they got it. I might ask some crazy question like, what did the women of Montgomery do? They can either answer it or they can't. If they can't answer it, I have some teaching to do. If they can answer it, boy, this isn't as hard as I thought. They can handle this kind of construction. So what could we do with this sentence? One possibility that I've learned about over the years is a lot of times if you have internal punctuation in a sentence, the information between punctuation points is extra information. You can take it, set it aside, and so on. So I'm taking this piece out, this both young and older, but I can put it back, so don't worry about that. But I'm just going to take it out to see if this gets any easier. We can put it back at the end. The women of Montgomery would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments, or their Sunday suits and blouses that needed just a touch. For some kids, what I just did solved the problem, and now they can make sense of it. But let's say your kids aren't quite that sharp. Let's not let them catch on quite this quickly. I only have one more punctuation point that I can work with. That's the M dash, so I'm definitely going to break there. Where else would you break this sentence? And you don't need to be a linguist to do this. You need to know the English language. Where would you break it? I think I heard somebody say something. I heard or. Let's try that. Let's break it at the ors. Conjunctions. I don't care if you know that language. That might be nice. It's easier if you know it, but ands, ors, buts, that kind of stuff. The conjunctions. There's a bunch of them in this, so it could be quite useful. Let's take a look. The women of Montgomery would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments, or their Sunday suits and blouses that needed just a touch, a flower, or some velvet trimming, or something to make the ladies look festive. And again, I bet a whole bunch of kids go, I get it. Now they can answer your questions about it. Now they can tell you what this is about. That's cool. But I'm told you guys have, your biggest minority population is Hispanic, right? You have a number of kids who maybe they're not hearing a lot of English at home. So this is terrific, but for some of them, they're still looking at this and going, I don't get it. I still don't know what the sentence says. They still can't answer your question. So let's go one more step. And again, gee, some kids, the first little thing solve it, some the second little thing. That first part, the women of Montgomery would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments. I'm not terribly worried about that. That's what we call the independent clause. Most kids will get that part of it if they read it. It's down here, or their Sunday suits and blouses that needed. It's the dependent clause. What's it dependent on? It depends on the independent clause, right? And so you get this parallel, their fancy holiday dresses, their Sunday suits or blouses. The way the sentences really needs to read in terms of meaning is something like this. The women of Montgomery would come in with their fancy holiday dresses that needed adjustments. Or the women of Montgomery would come in with their Sunday suits and blouses that needed just a touch, a flower, or some velvet. And I bet you all your kids, or almost all your kids, that have it by that point. They don't know to do that, guys. They don't understand what it means to try to understand a sentence. We just assign the sentences and hope they get them. If they don't get them, we just move on. It's not terribly different than what Megan was describing in her high school. I'm from the rusty little tin roof house from washing by hand and line drying. This was a poem written by a high school student at a writer's workshop. And you'll see people trying to teach a piece of poetry like this. They'll try to get the kids to interpret this poem before they comprehend it. And I would suggest that this sentence might throw even some high school kids. It's not as long as some of the sentences I've shown you. So the first thing I'd do is I'd probably break it down in parts. I'm from the rusty little tin roof house, from washing by hand and line drying. The second and third parts are a little puzzling. What if I play with those a little bit? I am from the rusty little tin roof house, and I am from washing by hand, and I am from line drying. Uh-oh. I'm starting to get the metaphor. What is this person saying about themselves? Over and over and over again. I come from a poor background. I come from this kind of neighborhood. We didn't have a nice roof on our house. We just had a tin roof. We didn't have a washing machine. We had to wash our clothes by hand. We didn't have a clothes dryer. That's where I'm from. I'm from the factories. I worked on the line. I was a tool and die operator here. That kind of thing. I am from the rusty little tin roof house, from washing by hand and line drying. And so once the kids understand what they're telling you, I'm from this, I'm from this, I'm from this, what does it mean to be from those? You can get at what the metaphor is about, but you got to get them to understand what the text is. And you do that at the sentence level, not going and giving them a speech about this. You show them how to read those sentences. This one we're not going to do, but I wanted to show it to you anyway. This is an interesting one because, well, it's 68 words long, this sentence. It's got 7 commas or semicolons. It's got parentheses and typographic cues. Where did I get this one? This is actually from the first fiction passage in the ACT, in one of the versions of the ACT, one of the forms of the ACT. This is what your kids might be asked to read to get into college. There are a lot of kids who are going to get into the middle of that first sentence and go, I'm not going to college. This is crazy. They don't know what to do with a sentence like this. And so I've done the work on it, but I'm just not going to go through it all. First thing I would do is break it up by its punctuation. And so you end up with something that looks like that, or you could draw slashing lines if you had this in paper. Then I would go through and I'd find the verbs, and unlike that 4th or 5th grade sentence I showed you, as you can see, there are a bunch of verbs in this sentence. And what I would do is, in some cases, there's more than one verb in a particular, so I break those up. And then I would go in and make sure I knew what the subject of each verb was. So while filling out my certificate, who was filling out the certificate, that kind of thing. And I would end up with something like that. In other words, I'd end up able to comprehend the doggone sentence and not just overwhelmed about it. Think about it. With vocabulary, I criticize how well we teach kids to use context, but the fact is, if I'm reading on my own, if I'm taking an exam, if I'm trying to get a job, if I'm in a situation where nobody's going to read it for me, what do I do when I come to a word I don't know? And we teach kids, maybe you can break the word down using morphology. We teach kids, maybe you could use the context and you could come up with a pretty good guess what the word means. In other words, it's not an on-off switch. It's not, you either know this word or you don't know it. If you don't know it, you can't understand, and you're out of here. There are things I can do. When it comes to sentences, we're giving kids nothing but an on-off switch. I could read that sentence without understanding. I couldn't read that sentence with understanding. What do you do about it if you can't read it with understanding? There's nothing. The school has given me nothing. There's nothing I can do with it. I don't know what to do with it. I just don't understand it. I'm suggesting that we actually make this part a regular reading experience for our kids, that they have to make sense of these sentences and break them down. You look for particularly long sentences, you look for internal punctuation, you look for dependent clauses, multiple phrases to define things, or to modify things, parentheticals, passive voice, things that you think make the sentence hard, and you identify those sentences and see if the kids understood them. If they don't, you teach them how to understand them. And over time, the kids not only understand the text you're working with, but they start to come up with some tools. When I come to a sentence like that, I can break it down myself. I know what to do with it. The teacher does this with us every day. We do this in our science book. We do this in our social studies book. A third kind of example is cohesion. Texts aren't just lists of sentences. The sentences have to cohere. The ideas have to connect. One of the biggest problems kids have, they might understand the words in the sentences, but they can't come up with what the overall text is telling them. I've got an example here, and this actually comes from the second language research, so it has some relevance to the boys and girls you're working with. The killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments its prey before it eats it. The killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments the penguin before eating it. Which of those sentences is easier, say, for a second language reader to understand? See lots of people holding up two. Either they're trying to tell me it's around 2 o'clock, or they're telling me it's the second sentence is the easy one. And you're right, it is the easier one. That's what the research would say. In English, you have, when it comes to a noun like this, you have various choices in what to link. And so, for example, the second sentence, the killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments the penguin. I can repeat the word again and again. I could just keep saying penguin, 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 and you would know it's the same penguin. It says the penguin. It's not a penguin. It's the penguin. It's the same one he was just talking about. So that repetition tells me that that second idea is happening to that same penguin that the first thing happened to. Another possibility is illustrated in the first one, in the first sentence up here. The killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments its prey being the penguin, Pray in this case is a synonym. It's another noun that means the same thing in this context. We have other possibilities in English too that aren't on here. For example, it could say, the killer whale tosses the penguin into the air and generally torments it before eating it. Right? We could do that. Pronouns work. Those kinds of linkages, being able to follow that idea, to recognize that the penguin got thrown into the air and the penguin gets eaten, is what you have to do to understand that story. If you can't link those ideas, you won't get it. So a 5th grade passage, I've lifted it out of a 5th grade reading book. Meanwhile, the nebula continued to orbit the new sun until it formed a large flat ring around it. Scientists call this ring a protoplanetary disk. The disk or ring was hottest where it was closest to the sun and coolest at its outer edge. As the disk swirled around the sun's gravity went to work. It pulled and tugged at the bits of rock, dust, ice, and gas until they came together in clumps of material we now call the planets. Here's the scene. You're a 5th grade teacher. This is the text your kids are supposed to read. You have asked the class to read this silently, and you're going to discuss it. And this is the day you're being observed by your principal. And this is the one that counts. They actually have the pad there where they're writing all the stuff down for your evaluation. And you have a question for the kids when they finish reading. You ask the question. You say, what is the scientific process being described in this passage? And the kids all look at you with blank looks. They don't know what to say. And the principal is writing notes on the pad in the back of the room. What do you do? And what I think a lot of teachers might do is something along doing something along these lines, maybe saying, I knew you'd have trouble figuring that out from that passage, that you couldn't figure out that this is about how the planets are formed. But that's okay, kids. Gather around my desk, or gather around the whiteboard, or these days watch your screen, and I'm going to show you, I have an animation showing how planets are formed. And the principal will probably write something down like, what a good teacher. The lesson didn't go the way she thought it was going to, the way it was planned. Kids couldn't answer the question. So she adjusted and used technology. Wow, we won every which way. And my evaluation of the teacher would be, oh, what a terrible teacher. She surrendered without firing a shot. She didn't even try to teach the kids what they were having trouble with. What a big mistake. See, I would suggest that before we show them the animation on the computer, that we actually analyze the language of the text and see if we can figure out what the heck this thing says. And so I've read this thing a number of times. I don't think the kids' problem with this one is the vocabulary. I don't think it's the sentence structure. I think it's the cohesion. Like in a lot of science, you have to identify that first idea, connect it to the second idea, connect it to the third idea. And if you don't make all those connections, you don't get it. So let's take a look at what we would do with this. What I would ask the kids to do, and I would probably do this with partners, which is obviously we're challenged with right now, but I would want to do this with partners typically. And the first thing I would ask them to do is, first let's identify the first scientific concept that's introduced in the passage, and then I want you to identify all the words that are used to refer to that concept, right? And so this is like the cooking shows. I have one made up for you here in another oven I can show you. Meanwhile, the nebula continued to orbit the new sun until it being the nebula, formed a large flat ring around it. So we got the nebula and it's forming this flat ring. The next concept is the sun. So the nebula orbits the sun until the nebula forms a large flat ring around it, around the sun. Okay, so the nebula is forming this ring around the sun. The disk of ring was hottest where it was closest to the sun, and the disk swirled around the sun. Now the third idea is the ring. The nebula orbited the new sun until the nebula formed a large flat ring around the sun. Scientists call this ring a protoplanetary disk. This ring, this disk, was hottest where it being the ring or the disk, was closest to the sun and coolest at its and the ring's outer edge. And as the disk or ring swirled around the sun, then the sun's gravity goes to work. And look, it is back, like Freddy Krueger. You can't kill it. In the course of about 6 lines here, it refers to the nebula, it refers to the sun, it refers to the ring, it refers to the sun's gravity. The kids have to make those connections to understand the text. Do you think your kids are making those connections? Are you catching when they're not? And I know what the answers are. The sun's gravity went to work, and the sun's gravity pulled and tugged at the bits of rock, dust, ice, and gas. And now my favorite part. The sun's gravity pulled and tugged at the bits of rock, dust, ice, and gas until the bits of rock, dust, ice, and gas, came together in clumps of material we now call the planets. And I could imagine this on a whiteboard. The bits of rock, dust, ice, and gas equals clumps of material equals the planets. And it gets very pretty by the end. And now let's talk about what in the heck this passage was explaining. And I bet you a lot of your kids can get it. A lot of work? Because that's how you have to read science. That's what it takes. Now you want to show them, we've read about it, now let's see it. I'm going to show you the thing on the whiteboard, or I'm going to show you the animation on my computer. I'm all for that. That's cool. But don't back off on the reading just because they couldn't do it. Show them how. And that means teaching them the language. You guys are working with, what did I read, 9-10% Latina kids? Latinx kids? Is that right, or am I off on that? Around that. I'm not crazy in the number. It's 9 or 10 or something like that. Which isn't huge compared to other districts in Michigan, and yet it's the biggest group of kids like they have like that are challenged. Doing these kinds of language things that have been demonstrated for the last hour or so, frankly, are so obviously good for them. But in fact, a large number of our boys and girls who are native English speakers also struggle with these same elements. They don't know much about their language. That's the kind of stuff we were talking about at lunch. Let me give just a couple of more cohesion examples before the time runs out. There were several roads nearby, but it did not take you long to find the one paved with yellow bricks. What does one refer to? Are you sure? It says roads. If I were a Latino kid who just come here and I'm just trying to learn English, I would say, I know what one means. And roads, you told me if there's an S at the end of it like that, that means more than one. So how could it be one? Let's see if you're right. You're right. One of the hardest things to learn in English are not the pronouns, but the indefinite pronouns. The ones and any's and those kinds of things that do things like that. Surely, said John, like one who had lost faith in his memory, he used not to sleep in the kennel. John, Wendy said falteringly, perhaps we don't remember the old life as well as we thought we did. The first time I did this, I went, well, what about did? What does did refer to? We don't remember the old life as well as we thought we did. As well as we thought we did what? What does that refer to? Well, let's see if you're right. Aha, you guys are pretty smart. I like that, but this is the one that I played with. I didn't know that Cheshire cats always grinned. In fact, I didn't know that cats could grin. They all can, said the Duchess, and most of them do. I don't know of any that do, Alice said very politely, feeling quite pleased to have got into a conversation. And the first thing I asked here is I wanted to go after that dialect, them, and I wanted to go after this other indefinite pronoun. So what are those referring to, first of all? The cats, the Cheshire Cats. I didn't know that Cheshire Cats always grinned. In fact, I didn't know that cats, that's the Cheshire cats, could grin. They all can. Those Cheshire Cats, she means, all can. And most of those Cheshire Cats do. I don't know of any Cheshire Cats that do. This is how you have to think that. But then I got into, so you got that right. Then I started to wonder, what about that? What does conversation refer to in this context? Maybe this was a better question the first time. What's it refer to? All the parts and parts, right? It's all the dialogue between the two. You have to get, and this author is painting a picture, and he's doing it by connecting one idea to another. But that isn't how the kids are reading it. They're just reading a bunch of ideas and not making those connections. And so guess what the research shows about teaching those kinds of cohesive links? They raise kids' reading achievement. They improve their reading comprehension. They increase their ability. If you clarify them, like rewrite the text so those are all real explicit, their comprehension goes up. But readers have to learn to do those things themselves. Instead of putting kids in easy books and asking them certain kinds of questions and saying, now we've taught reading, what I'm suggesting is putting kids in books that the kids can already comprehend really well and showing them how to make sense of those texts, how to operate on the text. And there are many different scaffolds. Vocabulary is one, and syntax is one, and cohesion is one. But there are also things like, if I can get my list up here again. Oh goodness, I forgot about all of that. There are the complexity of the ideas themselves, and prior knowledge, and genre demands, and text organization, and tone, and so on and so forth. There are pretty much anything in text that can trip you up is something that kids could learn to deal with. But they need to be confronted with those kinds of texts. They need to be held accountable to read them. And somebody actually has to show them how to do those things. That can take place in both reading books and in content books. But it should be taking place, and we shouldn't be dropping kids back so much to those easier books. Let's face it, if you're in 5th grade and you're placed in a 3rd grade book, my question for you is, when will the kids get to read the 5th grade book? And if you say in 7th grade, that just moves to my problem. When, are we going to keep these kids till they're 23 or 24? We need to start teaching kids to read books that they can't already read. And I think the best way to do that is to focus really heavily on grade level text instead of on I have all these little readers and I can put you in one level and I can put her in another level, instead of doing that. Usually one of the reasons why teachers in science and social studies and other areas that have textbooks, the reason why the teachers do things like round robin reading is because they can't put kids in an easier book. I have only one textbook in social studies. I don't have 5 different levels. What I'm suggesting is we should be treating them all like social studies. Gee, we only have one level of this. Let's see what we can do to teach kids to handle that. That would give your kids a much better leg up and make it a heck of a lot easier for your secondary teachers to teach things like disciplinary literacy. And with that, I just want to say I hope you are able to find a good school year here for these boys and girls, and a good professional year here for all of you. Please go to my website, download anything you want. It's all free. There's no advertising or anything. It's just there. Have a good school year, folks. Thanks for being here. You're in charge.
Thank you. You guys all have an agenda for tomorrow. We'll see you tomorrow at 7:30 at the high school.